We arrived to the final lecture of our workshop. Here's Vidma, who is going to tell us about reevaluating Plato's criticism of art. An appropriate topic to end.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, I'm kind of very sad to be ending because this was really an amazing week and really, really insightful. And thank you so much to Victor and to his colleague. And thanks to my colleagues who were presenting papers, and especially to the students who were with us, encouraging us and asking amazing questions. And also joining us on our field trip, which was, I was just explaining my situation to Victor. I have never been so encouraged to really engage with visual art. And someone working in literature, that has been a true accomplishment for me. So thank you so much for kind of showing me an entrance, so to say, into another art form, and particularly into the way in which other art forms can relate to the topics that I do. So thank you for this amazing week, and now that we have both organizers, I think we can thank them for everything that they have done for us. So thank you so much for that. So what I want to do now is to kind of go back to the very beginnings of where the problems that we have been focusing on for this past week have actually emerged. Because there are some people who think, or maybe this is more like an anecdote or a funny joke about philosophy's progress, but there is this view that everything that is worthwhile in philosophy is basically traced back to Plato, and the entire history of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And while I don't do many other things in philosophy besides philosophy of art, I do think that with respect to art, this is really, in a way, it seems very true, because, and this is what I want to focus on today, pretty much every problem that we are discussing within contemporary philosophy of art and its problem of trying to understand what it is that we gain from art with respect to cognitive and ethical elements has somehow been anticipated, so to say, by Plato. So what I want to do now, as a way of concluding this amazing week on discussing cognitive value of art, is to go back to Plato and to see how much of what we are doing can in some sense be understood as response to Plato. I also want to see what are some of the things that he got right, because I think that there are things that he got right in his relentless, merciless criticism of art. But I also think that overall his view was quite misguided, if that's the right word, probably not. But I do want to suggest that although he was quite on the right path to recognize those elements of art that can be harmful, that he was very short-sighted and very unimaginative, to use Monica's notion from the lecture before, in recognizing its true cognitive and ethical values. So reevaluating Plato's criticism of art is my attempt to kind of see what are some of the insights that we can still rely on when we discuss art, and what are some of the things that he just got wrong. And fortunately, as I think I will show towards the end, those things that he got wrong are somehow more powerful, have been more powerful in the tradition of thinking about art. And this is still very detrimental for what, let's say, for some of our current educational and cultural practices, but also for our current understanding of what it is that art can do for us as epistemic and ethical agents. So for the purposes of this talk, I didn't take into consideration his entire, obviously all of his dialogues where he talks about art in one way or another, because that would be too much. So for example, I will not engage with the laws, although many people are now reinterpreting the laws as kind of his account of the benefits of musical education and how musical education can advance our ethical and political, perhaps, well-being. I will be only kind of focusing on the three main dialogues which people usually point to in order to show that he was extremely hostile to the idea that art has cognitive and ethical value. And these are Ion, Apologia, and the book 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic. And just to kind of give us guidelines as to how I'm approaching them, I developed this into some of the things that he may say with respect to epistemology, so with respect to our cognitive agency, with respect to ethics, so with respect to our, let's say, practical compartment, practical engagements with other people, and with respect to psychology, or what nowadays people might consider as psychological aspects of our artistic engagements. And to kind of, hopefully this will be clear, but it is a kind of a table that you have on your handouts. So there is the list of works, and then there are the three domains that I am interested in: epistemology, ethics, and psychology. So in the first part of the talk, I will very briefly go through some of the main claims because of the issues with time, but also because of how rich Plato's writings are. I decided not to put any of his quotes on the handout, so you'll have to take my word for it. But in case you are interested at some point in your future research, I did kind of note the references to those elements of his writings that I think are important for the claims that I'm making. So the letters and the numbers 387b, for example, of the Republic Book 3 are kind of references to the quotations that, again, in the longer version of the paper, I would implement to support my reading of Plato. So let me start by saying that when we talk about Plato's criticism of art, as mentioned, there are at least three main kind of worries that he had. One is that art, and he sometimes talks about dramatic art, meaning poetry and tragedies. Sometimes he talks about visual art, primarily the art of painting. I won't be so much concerned with these distinctions. I will primarily have in mind literary art, but both are equally, at least for the purposes of this paper. There are, of course, critics of art of Plato who claim that his views on poetry don't necessarily apply to visual art and vice versa. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but I'm not so much interested in the specifics of Plato's particular criticism of particular forms of art. For this talk, I'm kind of interested in the big picture. And the big picture, as you know, is quite detrimental to our idea that art is cognitively and culturally valuable. So in Ion, Ion as a dialogue is perhaps more interested or exploring more the notion of artistic creation. But basically, for Plato, the problem was because the poets are inspired by the muses, by gods and by muses, whatever they are creating is not really a kind of genuine true knowledge. It is an inspiration. They have absolutely no control over it, but yet they are presenting themselves as if they were knowledgeable ones, right? The kind of status that they have, the kind of the way in which they talk about themselves seem to suggest that they are the knowledgeable ones. And of course, given the role that mythology, for example, and other forms of poetry had in Plato's times, we can understand why the poets would have this educational role that prior to Plato was rarely called into question. And then what Plato does in Ion is to kind of have these very specific claims about the epistemic reliability of the poem, but also about the epistemic inferiority of the audience, where he kind of suggests that the only thing that Ion, not necessarily as a poet, but as an interpreter of poetry, the only knowledge that he has is the knowledge of poetry of this particular poet, rather than the actual, let's say, subject or the topic, the thematic level that the poem, this particular poem, is talking about. So for Plato, this is a kind of a very insincere manner in which poets are representing themselves, claiming that they have knowledge when in fact they don't. And the similar argument is then found in Apologia, where again Plato discusses unknowledgeable poets who lack understanding of what they are saying. So basically they are repeating something, it seems like they know, but in fact they don't have any right to claim that they really possess the knowledge that they are supposed to be spreading around. And then in the Republic Book 2 and 3, these claims are developed much further, they are given much more substance. So for example, and in Book 10, but in Book 10 with respect to visual poetry, So in book 2, because of all these problems, Plato is very, very concerned with kind of trying to provide us with the selection of the appropriate stories for primarily moral education of children. So with respect to the epistemological aspect of his criticism, I find this part to be deeply problematic, because what he's basically saying is that every time when a poet is describing something that is in fact true of human behavior, that good people don't necessarily get rewards for the goodness of their characters, that bad people do get rewards for being bad, that people are emotional, that people cry, for example, that people have vices, not necessarily only virtues, that people get sexual with other people, etc. He thinks all of these are deeply problematic, and he wants to remove all of these elements from the poetry, leaving only poetry which is kind of, as he sees it, conducive of the development of virtues. So in a way, while, and I find this very amusing, so to say, in Plato, on the one hand, he is so concerned with showing that poets don't really have the knowledge, but then on the other hand, he is further encouraging them to continue with this kind of deceptive depiction of what people actually do, because he believes this is at the function of promoting actually human well-being. So in the second column under ethics, you can see some of the claims or some of the reasons why he is doing that. So again, with respect to the second book of the Republic, it is here that he is trying to argue for the importance of the censorship of the form and content of imitative art. So it's really interesting to see that he's at once concerned with the proper representations in terms of what it is that poets can represent, the kinds of human behaviors, but also what we might call aesthetic means through which they do that. So he is very specific that there are particular kind of rhythms, there are particular kind of instruments, there are particular kind of verses that should be forbidden because they are too cheerful, because they kind of represent the manner in which people speak who are not virtuous people. So he is very, very concerned with both form and content of poetry. And he really wants to censor everything that he thinks is in any way potentially harmful. And of course, the reason why he thinks that this criticism has its value is because of the kind of psychological story that he has about the way in which people respond to art. And of primary importance here is his idea that imitative poetry, on the one hand, inspires satisfaction, that's just the way in which people are, but also, in addition to satisfaction, it also inspires us to imitate them, because we primarily identify with them. And Monica gave me a wonderful kind of introduction into the notion of identification with the character. And for Plato, that was in particularly important, not only because in his view, people will identify with what he sees as morally problematic people. So those who are not virtuous, those who are overly sexual, those who are overly emotional. It's not only that the audience will identify with them. Of more concern for Plato is the fact that because they identify with these sorts of people, these sorts of bad models, they will lose the ability or jeopardize their ability to do the thing that they should be doing, right? You probably remember that Plato had this idea that every man within the perfect society has to fulfill one particular function. And each function comes with a particular set of virtues, with particular set of mental capacities. And these capacities cannot be fully developed if you engage or if you identify with other creatures, with other human beings, so to say, because these other human beings have other skills that they need to develop. So if as a ruler, let's say, you should be kind of focused on developing your virtues which you need to be a proper ruler. So you need to be prudent, you need to be brave and courageous and just and whatnot, rational. And you can't do that if you identify with a fictional character who is emotional, who is, let's say, very driven by his sexual impulses, like apparently Greek gods were very sexual, and Plato thought that was a real problem for the purpose they had in moral education. So this idea that each man has to complete one particular job that needs to be, because of that he needs to be properly skilled, the art was seen here to be very, very detrimental to that. So because of that, we need very strict censorship with respect to the form and to the content. And this kind of censorship is very well developed in book 2. And it kind of goes on in the book 3, where Plato gives even more reasons to be concerned about the implications of our engagements with art. So he talks quite a lot about aesthetic features of poetic language. I kind of mentioned that briefly on my talk on Monday, so I won't spend too much time on that. But basically the idea is that the beauty of language can somehow inspire those elements of our rationality, of our soul, which are, as Plato says, the furthest away from our rational part, right? So I guess in contemporary terminology, this would imply that inappropriate forms of art kind of track our most bodily or most sensual elements, and because of that we tend to kind of lose sight of rationality, of prudence, of virtues, and all the other things that we should be kind of concerned with. He's also here again kind of giving us precepts on how to apply epistemic paternalism and censorship. So very, very strict control of representational content, and he develops this wonderful metaphor where images that we see in art can be used either as a good food or as a bad food for the soul. So he's very aware, it seems to me, that art really makes an impact on us, and that this impact can be either good or bad. And this is something that in contemporary, as you see when I approach contemporary interpretations, this is something that has been very, very much recognized nowadays. This idea that we have to kind of disregard certain kind of autonomist view, which see art as completely distant from our ethical and psychological, let's say, personality, but rather see art as something that can be really, really, really impactful on our agency in the very strong sense of the word. Again, in the Republic Book 3, with respect to ethical censorship in poetry and music, he's really clear that unjust people cannot be portrayed as happy and vice versa, which to me reads like his awareness that people really look up to the fictional characters and consider them as role models, or at least as somehow true representations of how people might behave. So art can very easily seduce us. And for that reason, I think Plato was very careful to kind of make it clear to the writers, to the poets, that they have to be very careful in what they are writing about, in the kind of people that they are representing, but even more so in the kind of consequences that these people actually experience, right? So you cannot have the situation in a fictional work where someone who is, think about Tony Soprano, for example, or Walter White, or any other just bad person, who is in the end kind of rewarded for the bad stuff that he does, because people will think that it's good, that it pays off to be like a moral monster, to be dismissive of other human beings, not to pay attention to them, right? To use Kant's notion, to utilize them, to use them as means rather than as ends, right? And again, here we see the problem of psychological impact, again emphasizing this notion of imitation and identification. And the problem here is that Plato, I don't think that many people talk about this when they talk about Plato, but when you read this book 2 and 3, you can really see that Plato was very aware that somehow good pedagogical art doesn't necessarily have artistic value. So there is one point where he says, if you look at how people respond to art, you see that they are particularly taken in by those works of art which do portray, let's say, naughty people, right? And when they do that in particularly aesthetically exciting manner. So all the things that we really enjoy when we watch good movies with psychologically complex characters. And for Plato, that was an issue, right? Because the more you enjoy these kinds of depictions, the more at risk you are of actually going after the bad models. And the bad models are always, to Plato, more exciting than the good models, simply because people enjoy them more. And simply because people will be more easily taken in by that. So the idea that art influences those irrational part of the soul and steers emotions. He says at one point that art plays upon those aspects of our soul, those elements of our soul, which are further away from the rational part, right? And if you add to that this idea that poetic language and aesthetic qualities are also very seductive, it applies that the most harmful form of art is the one which presents in the most aesthetically inviting manner those people who are deeply mixed with respect to good and bad, right? Not necessarily pure evil, but definitely someone who is not only good, but is kind of seductively inviting with respect to vices that he or she has. And then there are all sorts of other things. So imitating only, he really gives a list of the list of virtues that we should be imitating. So appropriate models are only brave people, honorable people, rational, moderate, and non-sexual people. And of course, if you think about that, this kind of gives you the list of virtues that Plato thought are important for the society as such, and also the list of vices that we should be kind of trying not to emulate, right? So, of course, in the book 10, he goes on and on and on and on about the epistemic unreliability, and we talked quite a lot about that with when David was talking about Collingwood's theory and what does it mean to get it right with respect to the artistic creation. So Plato was not as open-minded as we are nowadays, and he really, having mimetic theory of art, he was really like, it has to be the true representation, but of course it's not a true representation. It's twice removed from the world of ideas. The painters only see one aspect of the thing itself rather than the thing itself, blah, blah. I think this is rather familiar and actually least interesting to me for today, but we can of course cover that in Q&A. What I really think is interesting here, and something that hasn't been tackled by philosophers for many, many centuries afterwards, are his occasional references to this notion that, for example, Homer failed to inspire ethical education. It's only recently, I think, that people have started to talk about the ways in which, as society, we treat artists and poets and other kinds of artistic persona. And for Plato, he really had this idea that if these people were really the knowledgeable ones, then society would somehow look up to them. But he gives this example of Homer, and he says Homer failed to inspire ethical education. In fact, people did not really consider him a good human being. And not only with respect to ethical comfort, he has this amazing paragraph where he is kind of questioning, like when he is questioning Homer's achievements. I call this the empirical challenge, asking whether there are any actual advantages of what it was that Homer wrote. Like he says, show me which city is better guided or better protected because of what we read in Odyssey and in Iliad, right? And then he gives the examples of real world warriors and says this warrior, because of his knowledge, defended this city. But there's no city that is better off because of what Homer wrote, right? So there are no actual advantages of Homer's writing. Then he goes on suggesting that the audience lacks knowledge to judge the reliability of representation, and he kind of thus puts in jeopardy the entire process, right? So it's not only that the writers are epistemically lacking, so is the audience. The audience simply doesn't have the credential to judge the reliability of what is represented, and they are taking that as a given, failing to recognize all of these epistemic problems that he is pointing to, right? With respect to psychology, again, imitation associates with the elements in us far removed from intelligence. Poetry makes us went to those emotions that are hardest to suppress and most in need of being let out, right? So it is extremely hard for people to suppress their anger, their sexual desires, maybe their kind of other forms of, let's say, less than perfectly moral yearnings. And what art does, it vents precisely those aspects that are the hardest for you to kind of suppress. So it's bad all the way down, right? So you really have to be very careful about that. He also has this idea that good models are hard to imitate, and again, I think this can be very nicely related to high and low forms of art, where obviously it's very easy for people to imitate unvirtuous people, right? And the majority of audience is not composed of those people who exemplify virtues in their fullest capacity, right? Most of us are good in bad in some way, bad in others. We are sometimes selfish, we are sometimes angry, we are, revengeful, we are petty, we are not always good, right? And Plato has this idea that those few individuals who in fact are perfectly good are so hard to imitate that not only do the poets lack the skills to do that, also the audience doesn't really want to engage. It's too hard for the audience to engage with them. And those people who already are virtuous are not the kinds of people that would go to the theater anyway, right? So there's absolutely no appropriate audience for that, because those who are already good do not attend the kind of plays. And the plays, if they are portraying these kinds of people, would not be interesting to the majority of audience. And I think this is a very nice anticipation of the fact that, for example, more people now binge on silly television shows than they read Dostoevsky, for example, or watch Bergman's movies or some other really high art. So I think Plato was very aware of the fact that art can really invite the masses and engage a lot of people, but in a slightly problematical way. And these are the sorts of things that he is trying to kind of expel from his perfect country. So, very general overview, but hopefully I could make some interesting points about Plato's overall view, negative view about the arts. So what I want to do now is to kind of go over the legacy of his criticism and to see what aspects still remain and what aspects are kind of being changed in some way. So obviously one very big impact of Plato's criticism is his the overall general view of aesthetic anti-cognitivism and the negative view of the educational value of the arts. So I think pretty much any anti-artistic view that we have today is very similar to most of these ideas that we found in Plato. So for example, one of the most recent attacks on art and artistic and the cognitive and ethical value of art came 4 years ago from Greg Curry, when he is more or less, all of the criticism is obviously given in contemporary terminology, but it can be traced back to Plato. So Curry mentions the problem of epistemic reliability of the artist, though with less emphasis on the notion of pretending. Curry doesn't think that they are pretending to know. He basically claims it is given, it is part of the artistic practice that we don't expect them to have full knowledge of whatever it is that they are describing. So less emphasis on pretending, but still this awareness that we do not expect them and that they are really not epistemically reliable source of knowledge as, let's say, scientists are. David Davis, though he doesn't, I don't think that he subscribes to this, but he does develop the idea of fictional creation being any kind of creation that is not guided by the fidelity constraints. So you don't have to pay attention to how things are in reality. You don't have to report what you believe is real, and you can still create fiction, but just kind of writing without without being considerate to the reliability of your description. Lack of epistemic regulation of literary practice. So it's not that there is, unlike philosophical works or scientific works, when you write a novel, there's no peer review. No one goes through your work in order to check for facts, right? As long as you satisfy artistic criteria, it doesn't matter whether you are right or wrong. That's at least, I don't think that's the case, but that's Curry's perspective anyway. And of course, there is a long quote on the handout by John Gibson. I won't read it for the lack of time, but basically Gibson is very nicely illustrating this idea that there's simply this kind of epistemic discrepancy between the idea that we get knowledge and the very fact that artists are not supposed to be the knowledgeable ones, but the artistically talented ones. Noel Carroll, right? Artists are discharged, artists have no special expertise. So again, this idea that what they are good is knowing how to handle things aesthetically, but not necessarily having the epistemic credence to support their findings. And 30 years ago, famous article by Jerome Stonewitz, who kind of reintroduced anti-cognitivism, the idea that there is no method of arriving at a truth in art, no confirmation or possibility of confirmation. Artistic truths, like the works of art that give rise to them, are discretely unrelated and therefore form no corpus either of belief or knowledge. I actually think that most of the things that Curry says in his latest book go back to this paper by Jerome Stonewitz. So I'm just giving you an overview of contemporary anti-aesthetic or anti-cognitivism, that is very reminiscent, or that can be very easily traced back to Plato's view. And then, of course, there is the problem of the epistemic position of the audience. So there are no means of institutional confirmation of what is represented, incapacity of individual reader to judge the truthfulness of what is represented, and this is sometimes called the problem of fictional persuasion. So Stacey Frank, for example, argues that studies on fictional persuasion show that we fail to scrutinize information when we are engaged with stories, making it more likely that we will accept and eventually believe what we read, regardless of its veracity, right? So the idea that, again, the aesthetics of text, the aesthetic of a novel can be so empowering that we are basically taken in by what we read, and in doing that, we fail to acknowledge the barrier between facts and fiction, right? So we are being persuaded into something, although we know we are reading fiction, but because the fiction is so powerful, we basically read, as Stedlich Peterson suggests, in ways that seem insensitive to the truth. And this is actually something that has been reported with respect to contemporary television work such as CSI. There was the famous CSI effect where the lawyers, briefly after the show became mainstream in America, the lawyers came and said, look guys, to the juries, for example, these juries are expecting a level of credence that we can't give them. What you see in CSI, it's not something that it can actually be done, right? So the idea being that, or for example, House was also, there was also this effect where the sick people would come to the hospitals expecting that someone like House might solve their health issues, failing to understand that that's not really how the medicine works, right? And I'm sure you can find this. We already mentioned, with respect to one of the talks, we talked about the faulty representations in Ibsen's work. And I'm sure there are many, many others, right? But somehow we fail to respond to that while we are in the process of reading. And this is, of course, a big problem for epistemic reliability and for the view that art is cognitively valued. Moving on to the problem of empirical evidence, it is interesting that for many years, philosophers were not really interested in empirical science. And they kind of had this idea that when we talked about the cognitive value of art, what we are really doing is we are trying to understand how the notion of literature relates to the notion of its cognitive value, whether literature or art is more or less valuable because it has this cognitive element, without ever considering whether people in fact learn something from art, and if they do, whether this is good or bad. And then with the advancement of film, a century and a little bit more, a little over a century ago, people, but again, not necessarily philosophers, started to contemplate this idea that film can actually be a bad influence, right? That really, I don't think they related that to Plato, but the idea was that maybe there is something detrimental. And it was only then that people actually, and philosophers, really started to pay attention to what empirical sciences are telling us about the actual impact of art. So for the last 30 years or so, we are finally now trying to understand, not philosophically, but empirically, what it is that is happening when we engage with art. So this is a relatively recent, I think, recent phenomena, but something that Plato was very sensitive, centuries and centuries and centuries ago. One of the first formulations within philosophical work that I found of empirical challenge was in a paper by Peter Lamarck. But again, he is not suggesting we should do the empirical stuff, we should do the empirical work. He's basically putting this as a side comment. People didn't really hold on to that. But he says something along the lines, would we expect that those immersed in the great works of literature understand people and the world better than those who are not so well read? So this is a kind of invitation to do the empirical study. Yet there seems no evidence that such readers are especially knowledgeable about human traits as are psychologists or social scientists or even philosophers. Literary critics are not sought out as experts or advisors on human affairs, right? So the idea, and again, going back to Plato's views on Homer, the idea being that no matter how engaged we are with art, and no matter how much we think that art is good for us, we never actually seek the advice of those who read a lot or those who engage with literature a lot. In John Gibson's colloquial terms, this is a quote from Personal Conversation, not from one of his work, but he basically said something along the lines, we all know colleagues from English department who are not good human beings, right? So the idea being that you only think that you are getting better from works, but you are not actually. And there's all sorts of contemporary interpretation of these views. So Nanicelli talks a lot about that. Greg Curry now seems to be convinced that the only way in which we are ever going to settle the question of art's impact on people is by empirically finding out whether we become good or whether we become bad. If we don't have the kind of empirical evidence to support this view, we cannot state either one or the other. It all depends in the end, he says, on whether or not we can actually prove that we have learned something. And there are all sorts of problems why we can't really do that. So recent attempts to settle what I'm calling the causal question, so the question of whether or not we become good or bad, has delivered conflicting results. And this is the crucial problem, right? We have started to do the empirical research, but there are all sorts of problems with this research. One of them being that for every study which suggests, and you have a quote by James Young here, for every study that suggests that you do become better, you become more empathic, you learn more, you become more acquainted with certain things, there is also a study which suggests that nothing basically happened. You may be thinking about the issues represented in your work for a while, but not necessarily so that the knowledge that you've gained become incorporated into your body of beliefs, right? So the idea is that most of these studies are contradictory to one another. For every one which suggests that you learn, there is another one which suggests that you don't. So Greg Curry and Stacey Prehn had this 3-year-long research project which they conducted with psychologists, and basically they argued results failed to reveal evidence for enhanced social or moral cognition with increasing lifetime exposure to narrative fiction. So you may be reading your whole life, and in terms of your cognition or ethical sensibility, you are neither worse nor better off. There's absolutely no impact on your agency. Related to that, there is also the kind of empirical evidence I was now suggesting, or I was now discussing, relates to whether or not we learn facts, whether or not we learn things. But even more narrowly, there is the research going on with respect to ethical impact of arts, right? So again, research here is divided over positive and negative impact. So moral education versus moral corruption. This is also something that is deeply important and deeply problematic, but philosophers sometimes fail to understand that. So ever since Aristotle tried to show that Plato was wrong, philosophers were always concerned with showing that on the one hand, you learn from art, you learn truth, you become cognitively more better human epistemic agent, and that the ethical impact of art is going to be positive. You become more empathetic, you become more moral, you are better at discerning moral aspects of the problem, moral properties, you are more careful in making moral judgments. So it was always about becoming moral, right? It's what I call the romanticized view about our engagements with literature. But then, of course, the idea is that you can also become worse, right? There are forms of art, there are fictional characters, there are fictional depictions, which really can make you become worse off than before that. And this is something that philosophers have very rarely acknowledged, but it was very prominent with psychologists who were wondering about the impact of violent art and sexual art. So pornography, erotica art, and these sorts of depictions were kind of said to potentially have detrimental impact on people, right? So again, the research goes both ways. So on the theoretical level, people like, for example, Karl Plantinga, they again have this romantic story that he talks about screen stories have the capacity to form what can be called habits of heart, or ways of seeing and responding to the world. These are dispositions to believe, to respond, to act, right? But then there are also, and this comes primarily from psychologists, there are also apparently a long, 40 years now of research conducted by a guy called L. Rowell Westman, who basically claims that violent art, can be extremely detrimental for moral education. And he has been conducting research on children, and he was interested in exploring how children become aggressive. What are some of the elements, what are some of the factors that, when combined, kind of raise the possibility that a child will become later on in life more aggressive. So for example, he argues the consistent finding is that children who see violent film behave more aggressively toward each other. Watching media characters behave in a violent fashion can instigate a process of observational learning in which a new cognitive and behavioral repertoire promoting violence is acquired. He's very, for 40 years now, he doesn't give up on this claim. There are, of course, counter views. For example, I think it's Robert Ferguson who is his most passionate critic, and he has all sorts of reasons to make us question Westman's findings, having to do with the ways in which these studies are conducted, the way in which we define aggression and violence, the way in which he claims Westman fails to consider other factors that may contribute to that. We can talk about this in Q&A. But basically, again, we have at least some research which suggests that Plato was really right in thinking that people can acquire negative, negative or harmful manners of engaging with others on the basis of fictional representations. And again, because we are now aware of the ethical impact of art, going back to Plato, there are, as we can recognize, certain practices of censorship that are employed in our culture. So whether it is the ratings of the movie, you go to the movie and then there is a note saying, caution, this movie contains violent imagery or faulty language, I think it's the phrase. So we do recognize that sometimes certain members of the audience need to be protected, so to say, from potentially harmful impact of art, and I think this is where Plato's criticism is most evident. Another domain where Plato's view seem important, that is nowadays very, very actively debated, is this notion of identification with the characters. And Monica already kind of very nicely explained why this matters in our artistic engagements. So, as I mentioned before, for Plato, it was obvious that we identify with the characters, right? That's the only way in which you can engage with the story. And this notion that we identify with the characters is extremely important in literary and film criticism. For example, literary and film scholars don't even, very often when you read their writings, they don't even question this idea that we identify with the characters. That's basically the only way in which they talk about our engagements with works of art. It is through works of fiction. It is through identification. If you can identify with the character, usually that's the sign of a good movie. If you go out of the theater thinking, these characters don't speak to me, I couldn't really identify with them, then usually you did not find the movie as appealing as you might have found it. So for literary and film critics, and also for people like Kresma, so psychologists are also very quick to point out that this process of identification can have detrimental impact. If you identify with the wrong kind of a character, you can become morally corrupted in some way, right? If you identify with someone in a pornographic movie or a violent figure, you can then really develop a certain kinds of behaviors which are morally reprehensible and should be avoided. Rita Felsky very, very famously develops this notion of identification with characters. She's very, very famous. Now, I have to say, with respect to philosophers, they don't really like this notion, right? With the development of cognitive film theory, people like Karl Plantinga and Noel Carroll and Murray Smith in particular, they have all argued very extensively against identification, giving all sorts of reasons against it. So, for example, Carroll has this view that if you understand identification as you kind of filling in the space of the character, like, oh, this is how I feel, this is what we usually want. For example, females, we tend to identify with characters who are sadly in love, right? You want the guy who doesn't want you back, so obviously you identify with that. Or apparently men, when they watch action movies, they tend to identify with action heroes like Rambo. Oh, that's so great, if only right. But then people like Murray Smith and Noel Carroll kind of show that this is basically for all sorts of reasons. I don't have the time to go into that, but we can explore them in Q&A. That identification just doesn't work that way, because if you really identify, I'm going to speak from the female perspective, if I really identify with the main heroine, then I'm in love with her guy, so I don't want her to end with the guy, right? I want to be with the guy. So basically, the identification doesn't work, right? There are different models through which we engage with fictional characters: sympathy, empathy, liking them, sharing their goals. But these modes of engagement shouldn't be related to, or shouldn't be explained through the notion of identification, right? So that being said, of course, it is important for us to understand what we mean by identification with the characters, because it is only when we can understand that we are in a better position to understand when fictional characters can be seen as good models and when they can be seen as bad models for us. And finally, one other impact that Plato's criticism had is nowadays evident with this whole new thing about the immoral artist and the overall ethical and cognitive persona. So, as I mentioned before, people like Lamarck and Curry very clearly show that we do not treat literary writers as those who are knowledgeable with respect to a given topic, although sometimes they represent themselves as knowledgeable, and this is, I think, part of this greater influencers culture, when sometimes our actresses and actors and singers and pop people really do write from the perspective of experts. So you could see that very nicely during Corona, when they had all sorts of views about whether we should be vaccinated, whether we should be wearing masks, and people were very taken in by that. They're very influenced by that. So there is this, again, I think in contemporary culture, we can see that they are kind of overstepping the boundaries of their artistic achievements, trying to represent themselves as knowledgeable with respect to other things. But we are also, again, with the growing trend of attacking the artists and morally blaming them for their characters, actions, comments, the whole idea of the cancel culture, right? Although it may be different from what Plato had in mind, it's, I think, very similar to some of the reasons that he gave against allowing all poets to enter his society. So in conclusion, what I want to emphasize is that Plato is still significant and important source of the way in which we think about art and our engagements with art. So there is still a growing tendency to disregard the importance of art from our curriculum, where this tendency is, I think, supported by the same reasons that Plato had. If you are interested in this topic, I deeply recommend Laura D'Olimpio's recent book. She gives extensive analysis of empirical data, so she goes country by country, not country by country, but American, English, and Australian educational system, showing the position of art in each of them. So there is a growing tendency to downplay the importance of art for individual and public well-being, justified by the argument that can be traced back to Plato. I also want to suggest that although the political framework of current cancel culture may not share Plato's original motivation for prohibiting art in his Republic, it exemplifies his strategy in a way that is highly detrimental to the value of art, its ethical and cognitive potential, and in this it resembles Plato's short-sightedness. So again, although I think he was right to respond to the potentially harmful impact, I think he exaggerated his criticism and really failed to recognize the manner in which even harmful ethical representations can in fact be morally and epistemically beneficial for us. So Plato was right to recognize the importance of the causal question, but wrong to insist on censorship and paternalism. So he was wrong to sacrifice the truthfulness to the alleged moral development. What he should have done and what we should be doing today is to find ways to organize our artistic practices so that they can really speak to our ethical and epistemic agency. But I'm not suggesting that we should do that at the expense of valuing art for its artistic and aesthetic achievement. So in that sense, aesthetic education should be reconsidered, should be better implemented into our society, and should be better kind of supported by this kind of philosophical and psychological findings on what are some of the things that art can really do for us. And it is my impression that this workshop has really helped us see some of these ways. So thank you so much.